I'm one of Professor Bertelli's students, and he asked me to just briefly introduce our speaker today since he's in a meeting. Stefaan Walgrave is from the University of Antwerp. He's at Stanford for this year until next fall, and works mostly on social movements, election campaigns. So we'll be hearing a little bit today about the issue of issue ownership, which is how I guess parties sort of own specific rhetorical spaces, and issue spaces. So I'll turn it over to him. And when the food comes in, we can go grab our lunch. I'm assuming it'll be a box lunch of some type, or wait till after. So go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story about issue ownership, which is the link between issues and parties, and whether parties own, are identified, associated with, whether parties are most competent to deal with issues. And of course, this has all kinds of consequences, electoral consequences, but also consequences for public policy and so on. My evidence will be from a small country. I come from Belgium. Some of the evidence I gathered is international evidence, but I'll mostly show you some Belgian evidence. And let's assume that what we find in Belgium should also be found in any other country. I'm not sure about the US, because the US is a two-party system, which makes the dynamics of issue ownership a little different than in an 8 or 9 or 11 party system as we have in Belgium or in the Netherlands and in other smaller European countries. I'm trying to summarize and trying to integrate different papers, actually 5 different papers in one talk. So sometimes I'm going to show you a few tables, and then it's different topics, but I want to give a broad overview of what issue ownership could mean electorally and where issue ownership comes from. Okay, here we go. So what is issue ownership? Well, issue ownership, it's, before I'm explaining what it is, the concept, it's increasingly important for political parties. So due to electoral de-alignment, voters are less habitual voters, they are less ideological voters, and there is a tendency towards issue voting. And it has been increasingly used in research. I've done an overview, and of course, if you write about it, you must read everything. So searching for issue ownership, issue competence, those terms, and there has really been a boom. The concept was originally coined in the 80s, and then in the 90s hardly anything happened, and now the last few years there is really a boom, and it's increasingly used in research. It's a determinant of party behavior. So issue ownership, the link between parties and issues, explains why parties address some issues and neglect other issues or completely ignore other issues. And it's also a determinant, the literature says, of voters' behavior, of voting, and that's what mostly I'm going to focus upon. The problem with issue ownership, and my talk is meant to solve those problems or to highlight them and then to solve them, is first that issue ownership is a blurred concept. The way issue ownership, especially in the American literature, has been defined. You all heard about John Petrocek, who is the inventor of the issue ownership idea. I think the issue ownership concept is blurred, so I'm going to propose a solution and have 2 different dimensions of issue ownership that solves parts of the problem. Second, the effects are mixed. I'm going to show you that under certain circumstances, issue ownership has an effect both on the aggregate level, on the outcome of elections globally, and on an individual voter. Okay? Third, the origins of issue ownership are unclear. So far, issue ownership has mainly been considered as being something constant. It explains elections, but it has never been taken as a dependent variable. Where on earth does issue ownership come from? How come some parties are identified with some issues and other parties are identified with other issues, or with no issues at all? Like many centrist parties in Europe, Christian Democrat parties, they don't own any issue. They're just center parties. Okay? And then fourth, I'm going to claim that the classic measurement, one of those dimensions of issue ownership I'm going to talk about in the first part of the paper, is endogenous. We cannot use it to explain voting since it is the consequence of voting. Party preference leads to an identification in the heads of the voters between an issue and between any issue and the party the voter prefers. So these are the 4 points. I'm pretty sure I will be able to make the first 3. We'll see about the 4th one, whether I have time to talk about that part. And then there is another thing that it's mostly been studied in 2-party systems, while it might be even more interesting to study it in more party systems. Okay, here we go. So, blurred concept, effects, origins, and then the endogeneity of the classic measure. This is the 4 parts of the talk. Okay, I'm going to give you Belgian evidence. We have, as I told you already, a very strongly fragmented party system, which makes it maybe difficult to transfer Belgian findings to another political system like the American one. We have 2 separate regions. You might have heard about French-speaking and Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. Here I mostly talk about Flanders, and we still have no government. We broke the world record of being without a government, I don't know, half a year ago, and still we don't have a government. The elections were in June 2010. We're now October 2011, and still the government negotiations are going on.
But
so
it shows the stability of the society.
Yes, it
Some
shows.
people must say, get rid of them all.
It shows that government doesn't matter.
Convention, the bureaucrats matter.
So since the bureaucrats are there, civil servants, everyone gets unemployment benefits, everything goes on as normally. Just we don't have any policy, but which means that the government can't spend any extra money, which means that the budget deficit goes down almost automatically. Okay, but that's an entirely different story. But it's the peculiarity of the Belgian system. The data sources I'm going to use is voter surveys in 2007, 2009, 2010, different elections, content analysis of media and manifestos, so party manifestos, opinion polls using vote intention to vote for a certain party, and then experiments in 2007 and 2009. We did survey embedded experiments to try to manipulate issue ownership. So it's different types of evidence gathered over a longer time. Okay, issue ownership, the claim is, has 2 hidden dimensions that are conflated. First, there is competence issue ownership. This is the handling capacity of parties. This is the question, which party is best at dealing with the environment? Which party do people consider to be best to deal with foreign policy, to deal with the withdrawal of the US troops of Iraq? This is about competence, okay? This is the classically measured dimension. There is another dimension, and this is associative issue ownership. So AIO and CIO, these are the abbreviations I'm going to use. Associative issue ownership refers to what Stokes says. Voters are simply reacting to the association of parties with some issues, with some policy goals, and so on. So associative issue ownership is not the opinion or the attitude of people who consider the party to be best at dealing with a certain issue, but just a spontaneous link in the head of the voters between an issue and that party. So it's regardless of whether the voters consider this party to be the most competent. When I think about immigration in Belgium, I think about the extreme right party, okay? Anti-immigrant party, as in so many places in Europe. I definitely consider the extreme right party not to be the most competent to solve the immigration issue. Quite on the contrary. But still, when I think about immigration, immediately, spontaneously, I make the link with that extreme right party. These are 2 different dimensions of issue ownership that are not coupled. Of course, there is a correlation, but it's, as I will show, fairly low, and that have a different dynamic, and we should have more attention for the associative issue ownership dimension, because it's not a consequence of party preference. I'll show you later. Competence issue ownership is the consequence of party preference. It's not the cause of the vote, it's the consequence of the vote. While this is entirely different with associative issue ownership. It's a cognitive link that is not, there is no valence, there is no evaluation, there is no color. It's just, I happen to have those 2 concepts in my head at the same time. Okay, well, but the existing conceptualizations so far, the most definitions offer a mix of several aspects. So Petrocek is the inventor of issue ownership in the US, and Butch and Farley, maybe you heard about them, it's in 1983. Those are the ones who spoke about issue ownership for the first time in the European context. And their definition is a mix of both the associative and the competence dimension. So while the definitions are fairly broad and combine both dimensions, you see that the measurements that have been done since then, starting with Petrocek, Butch and Farley, now through the 2010-2011, the measurements are not ambivalent. It's always the best party to deal with X. So you see, the definitions of issue ownership have been 2-headed, while the measurements have been single-headed, only focusing on the best party to deal with competence issue ownership. So there is a neglect of the associative dimension, and I will show that the associative dimension is better to explain voting than the competence dimension, but I'll come back to that later. Okay, why does associative issue ownership matter? Why should we care about having competence issue ownership as it has been measured so far, and adding another dimension of the same link between parties and issues? Because there are several questions that the issue ownership literature cannot solve at present. First, there is a huge discussion about, and not really a discussion, there is just a complete neglect of the changeability of issue ownership. Where does issue ownership come from? My claim is, our claim, I'm not writing these papers just on my own, is that associative issue ownership, the spontaneous link between parties and voters, between parties and issues, it's much more stable, okay? So once the link between an issue and a party is made in people's mind, it's a much more stable asset, while competence issue ownership is much more changing. It depends on the performance. If a party screws up while in power, its competence issue ownership goes down, while its associative issue ownership just stays on the same level, because there is no balance, there is no direction. Second, where does it come from? The traditional issue ownership literature does not provide a good answer to the question, where does issue ownership come from? Our claim is that associative issue ownership comes from attention. If an actor, a party, stresses, talks about the issue all the time, even if they're not competent, if they talk about the issue, they would create a link in the heads of the voters. While competence issue ownership is the consequence of policy success or failure. So, to summarize, associative issue ownership is the consequence of talking, while competence issue ownership is the consequence of acting, of really policy success or policy failure in the other direction. Okay, and another question the issue ownership literature is wrestling with is how one can apply things that have been invented, mainly for the US and then in Europe, mainly for the UK, how you can apply this theory to a multi-party system. Because as Petrocik defines and operationalizes issue ownership, there is always one of the parties who is the issue ownership, simply because there are two parties. So there is only always one of the parties that is considered by the majority of people who give an answer to be the most competent. Even if it's only 51 or 84% of the electorate, if the other party is smaller and is considered less competent, Petrocik says the one who is most competent is the issue owner, okay? Which means that in a system with 11 parties, there is not a party, not a single party that is considered by the electorate at large to be the most competent party. In a two-party system, this is different. In a multi-party system, it's entirely different. So we need a more nuanced measure of the link between parties and issues to address and to make use of issue ownership in a multi-party system. And by the way, probably issue ownership is a much more powerful predictor of the vote in a multi-party system than in a two-party system. Okay. So, the measurement of associative issue ownership, I made the point that it's important to take into account associative issue ownership. The measure we used in a survey in 2009 and 2010, it's very simple. I'm not telling or doing rocket science. It's all very straightforward and very simple. It's the association. Can you indicate for the following issue which party you spontaneously think about when you think about an issue? So we explicitly ask people to react and to react spontaneously. It should not be the best party, just which party pops up in your mind when you think about the issue.
When you're talking about the associative dimension, if a party just stresses it over and over and over again, right? The agendas literature would kind of suggest that what matters is not which party says things about it, right? But what matters is just attention to a particular kind of issue. So is it, at what level of policy categorization does issue ownership have to operate? So my question is something like this. Suppose we're thinking about environmental policy. And there are two types of environmental policies. One is command and control, for want of a better phrase, and the other one is cap and trade, right? So does issue ownership operate at that level,
No.
or does it operate at the level of environmental policy altogether?
Yes.
Okay.
It's just the association. It's not about a concrete policy. It's just about the link between a domain of policy and a certain party. So it's not about how, because that comes close, because there is, of course, there's a third dimension, which is a positional dimension. You have the competence dimension, you have an associative dimension, and there is the positional dimension. What you say is a position, it's a concrete policy. How should we solve the environmental problem?
So in the data that we're moving toward, you would call what I just said a positional, that's a spatial model.
Yes.
Where I'm,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All right.
That's what I would say.
You know what I'm thinking of listening to? I'm thinking of economics of monopolies, and, you know, multi-firm things. Who produces the dominant product? And I'm not sure what I'm talking about now, but that's what I hear. In other words, you have two parties is sort of simple politics.
Yeah.
Multi-party sounds like markets.
Yeah.
I don't mean economic choices, just the idea of multiple actors soliciting consumers,
Yeah.
and there are notions of who.
Yeah, they just show that they care. By talking about the issue, they show that they care. It comes very close to your policy investment idea. Exactly. Just by showing that you care, you try to claim an issue. Whether your policies, whether people agree with your policies, yes or no, doesn't really matter. Or, of course, it matters, but that's the second or even the third step. Yeah.
It might be very useful to look at what the economists do.
Yeah.
With multiple, you know, well, not with monopolies, but with multiple actors offering, what do you call it? A different range of products.
It's branding. What they do
Right.
is give the party a brand name. When you think about the extreme right party, you think about immigration and crime. That's their brand. That's their corporate identity. So that's what issue ownership is about. Even, as I told you, even if you don't agree with the extreme right party, that they would do a good job solving the immigration issue and crime, you still, everyone acknowledges and recognizes that this is their brand. This is what they do. Not that this is what they're good at, but this is what they do. This is what they focus upon.
And there's that old literature on party branding,
Yeah.
Mike Munger et
Yeah.
al., right?
Yeah.
That is somewhat similar to issue ownership, but the mechanism is very different in issue
We think
ownership.
we think about a very spontaneous cognitive link. That's the idea.
That's
because
right.
I'll show you. So this is associative issue ownership, and then of course competence issue ownership is how suitable do you think each of the following parties is to deal with the issue of X. So is it competent to solve the problem? I'm not sure what the link is with positional issues. Probably there are three layers of links between parties and issues. There is a positional link, there is a competence link, and then there is a spontaneous, almost subconscious, I would say almost subconscious associative link. Here we show that these answers are spontaneous. These are issues in Belgium, and is the percentage of people who identify a party, the most associative identified party with each of those issues. So they are ranked order. When you ask people, who do you think about when you think about mobility, the mobility issue, traffic and so on, 40.7% of the people would mention the same party. I think this was the Socialist Party in Belgium, okay? And then you go up, immigration, these are all big issues. And here you have the environment. 95% of the people, in Belgium, when you say which party you think about when you think about the environment, 95% thinks about the Green Party. That's very, very strong associative issue ownership, okay? And then we calculated, since we did this in an online survey, we calculated the time people needed to make up their mind on average for each of those issues. And there is almost a linear relationship between the strength of the associative issue ownership and the time people needed to answer the question. So it's a log file. We just asked people online, which part do you think about the environment? And then for the environment, it is less than 4 seconds when they give an answer. And for mobility, it's more than 7 seconds. So this is how we show indirectly there is a kind of spontaneous link. You could, of course, argue that even when you need 4 seconds, it's not really spontaneous. Spontaneous would be immediately. Might be due to the fact that the button which they had to put, we don't know, but still, we think it's fairly strong proof of the fact that it's a kind of immediate link. Okay? Here is the stability. We have associative issue ownership and competence issue ownership. These are the different issues, a smaller amount of issues. We had 3 waves in 2009, % of respondents switching at least once across the 3 different ways of the survey. So, which means attributing competence issue ownership to another party between wave 1 and 2, between 2 or 3, or 1 and 3 waves, okay? And associative issue ownership, the same thing. We see that systematically across all issues, at least in our campaign of 2009, there is much more stability in associative issue ownership during the campaign than in competence issue ownership. Competence issue ownership is all over the place. People change all the time during a campaign. It was a little roller coaster campaign we had in 2009, but still, there is a systematic difference and a strong difference on all those issues. So it's spontaneous, quick answers, and it's stable. One of the points I wanted to make in the beginning. It's more stable than competence issue ownership. Okay, the conclusion for the first part is conceptualization. The existing definitions conflate the 2 dimensions. We did 16 different definitions, and there we can show for every definition that there is a competence aspect and an associative aspect, going back to the founders of the issue ownership idea. The existing measurements tap only 1 dimension. The associative dimension may solve some of the problems, and associative issue ownership can be measured. We call it reliably. I'm not sure we're proving that it can be measured reliably, but it can be measured, and it's something different than competence issue ownership. Okay, what are the effects? Why should we care about associative issue ownership? Does it explain anything at all, or is it just a hobby of some crazy scholars? Okay, there are 2 strands in the voting literature. First, there is an effect on the aggregate election outcome, and there is a micro effect on individual voting behavior. I'm going to show you 2 examples. First, aggregate election outcome, and then individual voting behavior, showing that associative issue ownership matters for the effect on voting. 2 examples in Belgium. The aggregate electoral success of the Vlaams Belang, which is our very esteemed extreme right party. Bad news for political scientists because they are going down in the polls spectacularly. This was why we did so good in political science in Belgium, or at least there was so much interest in Belgium, and now we're losing our only asset, which makes our country interesting, which is that strong extreme right party.
We still don't have a coalition.
That's the next hot topic on Belgium. And then second, I'm going to show you, based on 2007 data and 2009 data, the effect of competence issue ownership and associative issue ownership on the individual vote. So both aggregate effects and individual effects. Okay, aggregate success of the Vlaams Belang. Here the question is, did the media, so I'm going to make a detour and show it indirectly, did the media contribute to the success of the Vlaams Belang by emphasizing the issues owned by the Vlaams Belang? So the idea is media make the importance and the salience of issue in the heads of the voters go up and down. This is mainstream classic public agenda setting literature going back to McCombs and Shaw, 72 Chapel Hill study. And issue ownership is then the link between parties and issues. So media attention for issues drives voting is the question. And interestingly, the Vlaams Belang electorate, or the VB electorate, is lowly schooled and not very sophisticated, and all voting studies show that they're extremely issue-driven. So much more than Christian Democrat voters or socialist voters, not Green voters, because those are issue-driven too, but extreme right voters are very issue-driven. So the question is the link in the heads of the voters between the issues of crime and immigration and the Vlaams Belang, is that link activated by media coverage for immigration and crime, predicting the electoral results of that party. Here are the issues of the Vlaams Belang in the manifestos. 4 issues get a lot of attention, so we counted traditionally all sentences and quasi-sentences in the party manifesto. Flemish nationalism, immigration, anti-politics, and crime policy. Our argument is that immigration and crime policy are the issues mostly owned by the party. They get 10%, around 10% of the attention in the manifesto, which means that together it's 20%, while Flemish nationalism gets also 10%, but there are other parties who devote even more attention to Flemish nationalism. We have a Flemish nationalist party. So that's why we don't think this is really issue ownership. And then anti-politics, which means talking about politics, it's about corruption, bribery, talking about the political scandal. So the political system is rotten, that kind of issue. But there are other parties who devote almost as much attention. So that's why we think if we use the party manifestos, it's mainly about immigration and crime policy. And if we if we take a look at the Vlaams Belang voters, if we ask those voters in the 90s, why did you vote for the party? In many, many cases, they refer to those same issues. So this is the Vlaams Belang 99, 95, 91, 95, 99, and here is the average. Let's just take a look at the averages. Flemish nationalism, 5% of the voters talk about Flemish nationalism when you ask them, why did you vote for the Vlaams Belang? Immigration, 36%, more than a third of the voters, not queuing any issue. They could give any answer. I like the party president, I like whatever about the party. So more than a third mentions immigration. Anti-politics, it's a lot of the voters that mention it too. But here, if you compare this with other party, the party that scored highest next to the Vlaams Belang, you see that another party in the Belgian party system is fairly close, 32, 21, 20, 9.9, 22, 15.6. So there is a competitor for the Vlaams Belang on the anti-politics issue. That's why we consider anti-politics not be really a Vlaams Belang issue. And this happens to be, in the 90s, the Green Party. The Green Party was the strongest
That's just one party. The other is just one other party.
Yeah, it's one other party,
okay.
while immigration... So, no, it differs between issues, because this is the Flemish Nationalist Party, the one who won the elections now, N-VA, with the big party leader, Bart de Wever. That's the party who... And this is the Green Party. For anti-politics, it's the Green Party. And then there is crime. The issue was completely absent in the beginning of the 90s. It grew over time to 10.8%, but there are no competitors. So there was none of the voters gave crime as an answer in the early 90s, then 4.8% and 10.8%. But there was, from none of the other parties, one single voter giving this answer, and nothing changed much during the 90s. So that's why we consider immigration and crime to be the Vlaams Belang's issue, based purely on attention. Purely on attention in the party manifestos and on what voters said, why they voted for the party. So there is no balance, there is no direction, there is no competence. It's just mentioning the issue, yes or no. Okay, this is a very ugly graph, but I try to change it and work at it a little bit, so I just copied it. This is immigrant issues in newspapers and television news, 3 newspapers and television over time in the 90s. Okay, this is our independent variable. The link is ownership of those 2 issues. This is our independent variable, attention in the media to those issues. Our dependent variable is the predicted electoral result of the Vlaams Belang during the 90s, measured every 3 months based on a constant opinion poll. Okay, we have the same firm asking the same question, so there might be differences, but the evolution is a fairly good representation of what happened in the 90s. Here we have our simple, very simple time series model. It's really a long time ago. The paper was published in 2004, I think. So
Can we go back to the previous chart?
yeah.
What is when they all go down in 97, what does that mean?
It means that over time, so there is a decrease.
Just don't appear.
Yeah, there is a decrease in attention for immigration, and then at the end of the 90s, it booms again. That's basically what it says.
Right.
This is just immigration. We have a similar graph for crime, of course, but I just want to show you the
What
example.
happened in 1997?
I have no clue. The thing is, here we had, of course, we had problems with asylum seekers coming in, and then they were put on a plane. They were expelled. Is that the right English word? And there was a problem with them because one of them was expelled violently, and she died because the police officers suffocated her on a plane. So this probably happens in the US or in many other countries too. But so there was really here, there were some things happening.
But what's interesting, presumably other issues were taking up the space.
Yeah, so of course it's a multi-issue space, which means
It may mean that immigration may not have become, something else took over that dominated.
in '96 we had the biggest crisis before we had our government crisis now, which is the second biggest. We had a big crime scandal because there was a true criminal who captured children, and then we had the big White March, which was a protest against the political system and so on. So there clearly are reasons why it's so low here. Everyone was focused on other issues. So, but that doesn't explain the downward trend here we see here, but it explains why it's so low here. And then the policy change, so the shift in crime policy happened in 97 and 98, and so then there was again space on the agenda, on the public agenda, or at least on the media agenda. That's what we measure here. Okay, let me get back to this one. Here we see attention to immigration in a newspaper, The Standard, long time before the poll. In accordance with lots of agenda-setting literature, it takes time. So there are large lags between media attention and the public starting to care about an issue. So we find that it's a matter of months. So if we have only immigration in one newspaper, we find pretty strong explaining force. Then we have theft. So theft stands for crime. In another newspaper, we find fairly strong effects. And then if we combine them both, immigration in a time series model and crime, we see that based on just newspaper coverage and television coverage of two issues, theft, which stands for crime, and immigration, we can explain a fairly large deal of the electoral fate, or at least the predictions in the polls of what the Vlaams Belang would do. Yeah.
Do you have ideological slants on the newspapers?
No, hardly any. And there is definitely no ideological slant on television. So it's a public broadcaster, it's the commercial channel. It's really very neutral. This used to be a conservative, center-right newspaper, and this is what we call a liberal newspaper, but what you would call a conservative newspaper too. But this is Christian Democrats and this is liberals. So, but we've done studies on slant during the 90s. There's hardly anything.
So I'm wondering, just in terms of attention, if you are a likely voter for the VB, where do you get your news?
You would mostly read Laatste Nieuws, because Laatste Nieuws is the latest news. It's the newspaper of the lower class, of working class. And Vlaams Belang voters, at least in the 90s, were just, these were former, often ex-socialist voters, working class voters. So, yeah. But I know what your question is about. If you calculate the correlations between the different newspapers and attention to issue, the correlation is really very high. So here we find the Standard, which is a highbrow newspaper, but the Standard's correlation, the immigration coverage is very strongly correlated with the immigration coverage in any other newspaper. While this is different for theft, the crime coverage of Het Laatste Nieuws, it's really something typical for popular newspapers. So the Standard stands for all media, while Het Laatste Nieuws stands for the popular media. Basically, that's what we can, that's a little bit the broader picture. So what we see, it's not a proof that there is causation. We just see that there is a strong association between attention for the issues the Vlaams Belang is supposed to own, and at least to claim, and where the voters of the Vlaams Belang refer to, and coverage, attention, pure proportion of attention to those issues over time, over a 10-year period. And Dutch colleagues and friends did exactly the same for in the Netherlands for Pim Fortuyn, and they found exactly the same.
So on the only other thing that I'm thinking in terms of the setup here that I don't see is on the last graph you show this steady decline until 97, and then you see an increase after 97. The correlation from my eyeball test is very high after 97. It's less high after or before 97. Although,
especially this one.
Right, exactly.
This is the left-wing newspaper.
So I'm wondering if you did a Chow test or
Yeah,
something
maybe.
like that, just to see if you have a structural break, because I might think the coefficient would be different in those two regimes.
I don't remember.
Because that, you know, if your claim is that the media attention is driving it, I might say, yeah, I'd buy it after 97, no problem.
Yeah, because of course I should have shown you the dependent variable too. Then you could see that visually whether there is a correlation, yes or no. I just picked a few graphs, but it's there has been discussion in the media and amongst scholars from the breakthrough of the party was in 1991, whether the media was responsible for this. So there has been always a public debate. So it's definitely not something that popped up in 97. They say, oh, only then, but there has been, but we haven't. So we haven't done an analysis of a structural break saying that until there was no correlation, and then what we find is only explained or exclusively explained by the rise of it. No, I don't.
So if this thing that happened on the airplane actually shifted regimes, and all of a sudden the regime of media attention was different, then I think your story is different. But
yeah, could be,
yeah.
Could be. Yeah, I don't know. We haven't checked it, so I don't have an answer. Okay, so let's get through. Okay, this is the aggregate result. So we show that associative issue ownership works in the aggregate, at least for the extreme right party. Of course, this is the easiest case. Does it work also for a liberal party or for a center party? Because issue ownership is probably an asset for extreme parties. It's much less an asset for center parties who are really in the government. Here we show the individual effect on voting in 2007. What do we have? We have competence issue ownership measurement, we have an associative issue ownership measurement, we have issue salience, and we have the interaction between competence issue ownership and issue salience, and associative issue ownership and issue salience. Okay? The idea is, if associative issue ownership matters, it should matter in interaction with issue salience. Okay? If you think an issue is important, and when you think about the issue you think that is important, you think about a party, chances increase that you would vote for that party. Okay? This is, of course, what we find, otherwise I wouldn't have showed you the table. Associative issue ownership is not related, it's not a predictor, so it's in different waves. So we assume causality, wave 1, wave 2, okay? So associative issue ownership is not correlated, or it's not a predictor of the vote. If you think about a party, when you think about an issue, you don't vote for that party more. Because why would you? Because if the issue is not important to you, why would you vote for the party? Different is the case of competence issue ownership. When you consider a party, any party on any issue to be most competent, chances increase that you would vote for the party. Okay? The reason, of course, is because the causality is just reversed. You like the party and you consider the party, because you like it, you consider it to be competent. Okay? Here we see that the correlation or the interaction we should find is effectively there. If people consider an issue to be important, and if they spontaneously think about a certain party when they think about the issue, the chances increase that they would vote for that party. And that interaction is not there for competence issue ownership. Which means that, according to us, associative issue ownership, it's a much less endogenous, much less tricky, much less suspect predictor of the vote than competence issue ownership, because it behaves as it should behave. And here is the interaction effect. Party is not an associative owner, party is the associative owner. The more the issue gets important, if the party is the associative owner, chances of voting for that party go up, while if the party is not an associative owner, there is hardly any difference. So there is an interaction effect. The more important the issue becomes, interacting with associative issue ownership leads to a vote. We find this for 2009. We did exactly the same in 2010, and it's basically the same result. So it's robust across 2 elections, of course, in the same country, in the same region even, but it's different respondents, and it shows up in the same way. So conclusion about the effects, Associative issue ownership is an independent determinant of voting behavior. Independent, meaning in interaction with issue salience, there are no direct effects. It happens both on the aggregate level, the Vlaams Blok study is on the individual level, and associative issue ownership matters in the real world. It might have been one of the reasons why we had that boost of attention to immigration and crime issues in the 90s and leading to the breakthrough of that party. At present, immigration is completely off the agenda, crime is off the agenda, it's all about state reform, it's about tensions between Flemings and Walloons, and it's of course about the financial crisis. That's probably and there is hardly any attention in the media for immigration and crime. That's probably the reason, if we think through the logic what we found in the 90s, that the Vlaams Belang is doing very badly at present in Belgium. So that association is important in the real life. Let me tell you finally then, because I'm not going to tell you about the fourth part, this I would take too much time, is where does issue ownership come from? Scholars use issue ownership to explain change, but consider issue ownership itself as a constant. They speak about a track record, but very superficially. There is no real research about where issue ownership comes from. How come parties are considered competent and are associated with issues? So issue ownership is an independent variable. It's hardly ever the dependent variable of any voting analysis or any analysis at all. Is issue ownership eternal and unchangeable? Where does it come from? And how come parties get identified with issues? My claim will be that one of the reasons parties get identified with issues is because they get the occasion in the media to talk about issues. So the media make a selection of news, of issues they address, and they allow politicians to make statements on those issues. So the media selection of issues makes the link between issues and parties in the heads of the voters. Because it used to be the case that parties could reach the electorate using their own media and using their local branches and so on. This is no longer the case. So the only way parties can claim issues is by trying via the media to connect with the electorate and to show that they care about the issue in the media. Okay. Media coverage's origin of issue ownership. So the issue ownership is dynamic and mass media play a role. The media talk about parties regarding some issues and give politicians the opportunity to talk about issues. The same thing. Just as I think about the Green Party when I think about the environment, the same happens with a journalist. There is an environmental scandal. The journalist thinks, who should I show in my news report? What would be relevant? Of course, if there is an environmental scandal, he goes to the Green Party. If there is a problem with immigration, of course he goes to the extreme right party. If it's about unemployment, he goes to the Socialist Party. If it's about the family or whatever, or about religion, he goes to the Christian Democrat Party. When it's about taxes in Belgium, he goes to the Liberal Party. So just like ordinary people have that link, journalists have the same link. And they show a party linked to a certain issue in their own heads because journalists are just part of the public just as anyone else. Okay? So media talk about parties regarding some issues and give politicians the opportunity to talk about some issues. Parties get the opportunity in the media to express their point of view. The more they get this opportunity, the more their issue ownership goes up. That's basically the idea. It's a little bit problematic causality because where does issue ownership comes from in the first place if this is the selection mechanism of the media? My idea would be that parties devote a lot of attention to issues in their official communication, in their party manifesto, and that media pick this up and there is a kind of reinforcing circle of attention. But of course, it's initially parties who claim an issue and who start devoting attention to an issue. That's why the party is called the Green Party and not the Yellow Party. Green stands for environment, of course. But still, I don't want to push it that far. Our idea is that on free issues, issues that are not owned by any party, parties can gain most by devoting attention to an issue. Okay? On issues that are owned by other parties, they might have some chance to increase their issue ownership. But if they already own an issue, if they are already considered to be competent about an issue, it doesn't matter that much whether they talk about the issue, yes or no, because they're already identified with the issue. So that's basically the idea. Free issues, others' own issues, the effect of media appearances should diminish. Okay? Experimental design, 4-wave panel survey, a lot of people in February, June 2007. This is not a representative sample, of course, but it's a nice sample. More young people, but we've went to football stadia to distribute leaflets to become part of our panel. So it's a fairly diverse sample of voters. Non-representative, but diverse, pre-measurement, stimulus post-measurement, and post-measurement. I'm only going to discuss these two. So what we do, we show people a clip of a politician in a newscast talking about an issue, and then we see whether this has an effect on their issue ownership. The dependent variable is how suited is party X to determine policy Y. If you recall the first part of this talk, right, it's competence issue ownership and not associative issue ownership. Because this was the first paper we did before we started thinking about issue ownership and associative issue ownership. So the dependent variable is competence issue ownership, which is, as was my claim in the beginning, much more dynamic and variable than associative issue ownership. So the spontaneous link is stable, while the perception of quality of competence is much more changeable. What do? We have a fake news item, a public broadcaster. We have a short clip of 30 seconds embedded in a real news show of 3-4 minutes in total. And we have divergent questions in the questionnaire. So it's a survey embedded news clip. And each, the fake news item was 1 or 2 party leaders explaining their party's stance on an issue. Okay? Parties spoke about their own issue, their issue owned by another party, and issue not owned by any party. Here is an example. Belgium is a small country. I can pick up my phone and call any party leader and ask him to collaborate with us. These party leaders all collaborated and gave their real party view, party leader, about any issue we asked them to give their view about. So I think we had 7 issues, and we had 5 party leaders, which gave us 35 news clips. We put them, embedded them in the fake news broadcast, and this is what we do. So this is the official, what the public broadcaster does. The public broadcaster helped us to format to make the clip as real looking as possible. So the external validity is pretty high. At least that's our claim. Here are the results. Here we have a party talking about an unowned issue. This is the control group. And here we have 2 parties talking about unowned issue, because we have a condition of 1 party and 2 parties, but that doesn't matter. The results are very similar. Here you see that when one party talks about an unowned issue, it manages to increase its issue ownership score by 0.33, which is significant, while in the control group on that party and that issue, or that 2 parties and those 2 issues, there is nothing much happening. Which means that if parties get the occasion to express their view on any issue that is unowned, in Belgium it's defense, nobody cares about defense. I think we have 3 boats and we have 20,000 soldiers, that's about it. So nobody cares about it, it's not an issue at all. So we took this as an unowned issue, and it's actually very unowned. 2 parties, exactly the same. Both parties managed to increase their standing on an issue, okay? And again, in the control group, nothing happens. If we take an other party's issue, you see that the party manages, so if the Socialist Party can talk about the environment owned by the Green Party, it can increase its competence on the environment. And when the Green Party can talk about welfare or unemployment owned by the Socialist Party, it manages to increase its standing while there is nothing much happening in the control group. And when the 2 parties talk about issue ownership, there is nothing, it increases too in a significant way. And here we see in the control group that those 2 issues and those 2 parties were at that time, over the time between wave 1 and wave 2, decreasing. So this is definitely a significant result, because in the control group it was significantly going down in that period. Yeah.
Just one question. Earlier in the survey, was there anything that could have primed the survey taker to understand the ownership patterns of these issues?
No, it was asked in the very beginning of the survey, and so there were no issue questions whatsoever. So issues were completely absent in the survey, and only after we did the experiment. So after wave 2, so after the stimulus was in the beginning of wave 2. And only then, And then we put the dependent variable at the end of the survey. The stimulus was in the beginning of the survey, and no, it was not. And then there were a few diversion questions about the quality of the party leader. Did he perform well or badly or something? So we said it is a survey about the quality of the communication of party leaders.
Well, you see, maybe you see where my question is coming from. I'm wondering if there's a knowledge effect, right?
Yeah.
If people just, what you've got is a sample of people who don't know very much about politics, and so when somebody does this, right, does that shake out afterwards?
And another problem might be that, of course, it was a very short, it was a 30-second news clip, which we manipulated, embedded in a real news show of 3.5 minutes. But we asked people a fair amount of questions on that 30-second news clip. So by asking the questions and by focusing them on what they had just seen, there is a kind of artificial thing going on, of course, in that kind of experiment, because most of the time people sit as couch potato, they watch news, and it goes on one ear and goes out the other. While here we really ask people, so I think the external validity of the stimulus is fine, but asking people 5 questions after a 30-second news clip, it changes their perception and what the news clip does with them, probably. I agree.
So it could, I mean, the interesting part of that is it goes back to your sort of mechanism question anyway, right? So you've got 2 tracks, right? We've got this sort of party brand issue.
Yeah.
And so the party brand can be translated through the media into either competence or associative issue ownership. And the party brand can be, the same thing can happen into associative ownership, right? What may be happening if you have very unsophisticated voters, right? You may be using that thing to create associative issue ownership.
Yeah, and I'm going to show you on one of the next slides about, this is competence issue ownership, handling capacity. Here we ask whether they are suitable to deal with a certain policy. I'm coming back to that, Tony. Here you see when parties own the issue, doesn't do much. They're already very high. So, of course, we see that for those parties in those issues, in the control group, it goes down significantly, which means that the fact that it's stable in the exposed group might also be considered as being an effect. Okay? And this is exactly the same for the 2 parties condition here. So in the new paper, which I finished last week, it's exactly the same. We did the same in 2009. This was 2007 data, 2009. But then we took associative issue ownership as the dependent variable and not competence issue ownership. So competence issue ownership changes. If a party gets the occasion to speak about an issue, its competence issue ownership goes up. With associative issue ownership, the results are entirely different. Okay? The associative owner gets even higher associative issue scores after exposure. So the Green Party, being at 95% before the experiment, when the Green Party leader can talk about the environment, it goes on up to almost 100%. The party that is not considered the owner, if the Socialist Party can speak about the environment, nothing happens with the Socialist Party. Even on the contrary, if the Socialists talk about the environment, the Greens' associative issue ownership on the environment goes up. So this is how strong associative issue ownership is. So if another party talks about your issue, it would be beneficial for you because you would even more, even if the party is not mentioned in the clip. Okay? So this competence issue ownership, you can claim it. It goes up. But associative issue ownership, since it's that spontaneous link, that construct in your head, talking about it won't help you. To the contrary, it will harm you because people will start thinking about another party when you are claiming the issue. Yeah.
Could it be triggering if you see the clip and you see them as being not competent in their way in which they're talking about the issue? Could it be that it's triggering? Wait, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Who knows what they're talking about? Yeah. And that's what's triggering them to think of.
Yeah, but they think about. It's not about competence because in 2009 we repeated the 2007 experiment for competence issue ownership in the same thing, and we found basically the same as in 2007. In 2009 we added associative issue ownership, and we find something extremely different. What our claim here is that parties cannot fake an history of attention. If there is a link between issues and a party, yeah, it's difficult to say, I care about it. Your whole past shows that you don't, or at least that another party cares more about it. So, of course, the question is then, how does associative issue ownership comes about? If you cannot change it, then it's considered being absolutely stable. So this is still a problem.
It's not really a problem, though, right? Because suppose go back to the branding literature, right? Suppose I'm a candidate, and I can position myself at the median voter where it doesn't appear. Then I would be in your non-associated group, right? Or I can position myself on one of the polls, right? And I become associated with these kinds of issues, right? So I'm not a moderate in any respect if I take a position on that. If I make a commitment to that in a sort of dynamic process, right? All the costs on the associative side, all the costs are going to be from me taking a position that's contrary to that. However, the thing that I found really interesting about here was when you read these two results together, right? If people are smart enough, that's the shocker to me here. People are actually smart enough to know the difference between competence and association, right? Yeah. So when they see those questions, they actually know that. On the competence side, if somebody else sounds competent, you might say, what your survey takers are saying is, this party could do something about this, but it's not their issue.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So if they're in power, I might expect policies in this way, but that's not their issue.
So they don't really care, which means that voters would probably consider the party as capable, but it's not important for the party. So if the party gets in power, if it implements its proposals, it's fine, but it's not sure it will invest really, policy investment, in carrying out its proposals, because it's not important. So what do you want most? A party that cares about your issues, that you care about, or a party that has the right policies? That's basically the difference between competence and
But you,
yeah, and even I would just one follow-up, even in a sort of a Labour-Shepsley kind of spatial model, right, of coalition formation or whatever. What you're saying is there's a reason why we put those ideal points in the places that they are, right? Because those brands have committed those parties to a spot on the ideological space. Yeah. And even though the competence of that party, once they're in office in terms of the perception of the people, that's good. We still know where they are in the ideological space. We can still use those models ex ante and coalition formation and things like that.
Anchor.
That's pretty straightforward.
Two analogies that might be useful. One that obviously comes to mind is the so-called Republican Party's competence in the United States on foreign affairs and defense, where at least the Bush is generally recognized they screwed up, and and Obama's done pretty well.
My idea would be that in competence issue ownership they have gone down, while in associative issue ownership not much has happened.
but this is my question. Is there's
No, let me go on.
Yeah, okay,
I
sorry.
mean, no, right, but I don't think it'll affect the associate, right, exactly.
No.
Which is what's interesting, of course, right?
Yeah.
That performance does not affect feeling.
Yes.
And the Democrats don't seem to be able to cash in on it. And then I think also of Apple versus all of its other competitors, where again, it makes an associative claim and a competence claim. And then the question is, can someone else take some of its coolness claim?
Yeah.
Now, Microsoft can't. We see that. Microsoft is not going to be cool until we die, right? But Google Android is trying to do that.
Yeah.
And so what I'm really trying to say is that this kind of analysis must be of great interest to the people who worry about corporate advertising and brand more generally.
Yeah, it's very close to that. Our main concern is now, we published a paper of competence and associative issue ownership last week, Monday. I got the news that it's accepted for Public Opinion Quarterly, which is a good statement. And of course now we want to replicate it in other countries, because this might be a Belgian artifact. We don't know. I think the dynamics are different in a two-party system. But so our main concern, I think you're right, it's about branding. When I ask my students, when you think about the Liberal Party, what type of car do you think about? Do you a Volkswagen or an Audi? You have got those German brands. The Liberal Party, which is the party of the higher middle class and upper class, all of them would say Audi. So these links, spontaneous links between, and Volkswagen, which is also in the US probably the smaller, cheaper German car. So those strong associations, they are really very strong, and I think they are very powerful. That's the idea. That's the idea, and they are stable. Okay, let me
I
finish
just
my
want to
talk.
encourage you to talk to your people in the business schools.
Yes.
And maybe I'd like to know I'm wrong when I say this analogy. But it strikes me that the whole discussion has nothing to do with politics per se.
No, I agree.
And it's a more general phenomenon
Yes.
of let's say, you call it branding or loyalty or whatever.
In psychology, they call this the implicit, is it implicit assumption or connection? There are many measures about those spontaneous links. So it's something that in psychology is all over the place. Right. The things it just happens with you. Even if you don't want to, you make that link. Okay.
Well, the two big questions come up.
Yeah.
He can finish and then I'll.
No, okay, yeah.
Is how is politics different, or isn't it, or maybe not? And the second question, so that's one that sort of, the second question is, can you change, how do people change associative, associations, issue ownership?
I think he gave you the answer to that one though, Martin.
How?
It's not very easy.
I know that.
Yeah.
That I don't need to be told. What I'm saying is, say I wanted to change it.
Well, maybe you can't. Maybe you have to disband the party and merge with another party or something like that.
I just don't think that's right. I think that everything I have read about advertising and, and
of course, it can be changed, but it will take a long time.
Right.
So you can't change during a campaign. You can't change. Okay, I'm going to try to
No.
claim crime.
But I'd like examples.
It will harm you. It's just they are punished in the beginning. When they change the U-turn in the beginning, they are punished. Right. Maybe after years, it will give them some rewards, but in the short term, it's a bad strategy.
I agree.
Yeah.
And so, for example, if you say you have the new cute iPhone, all right, all it makes people think is it's not as good as the iPhone, even though it's cute. Okay, so if you go the cute phone line, you immediately help your opposition.
Yes.
But sometimes things change, and and yes, it takes time and all that, but it'd be interesting to study in this context those changes.
But probably a dramatic screw up in terms of competence can change association too. So if you really, I don't know about the Iraq war in the US. I'm not sure whether everyone considered this to be a big failure. But if everyone considered it to be a big failure, then probably associative issue ownership might change too, as a consequence of failure in performance. I don't know, but let me.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and we have one more question.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I guess my main question is just that my question is it seems to me that there's 3 links, and you've spoken about 2, and I'm not sure how the third one fits in. Is that there's the association with saying when I think which party cares about education, I can name a party.
Yeah.
The second is when I think about what parties say, who can actually do what they say they want to do. That's competence.
Yes.
But the third dimension is what do I actually want done?
Yes.
Because
position.
That's the third dimension he brings up.
Right.
That's position.
Which seems to me because it could be that if I know that, so take McCain in 2008, I knew he cared about defense. Let's just say we actually, because of his background, we saw and because of the Republican Party, for whatever reason, we actually thought if they cared about invading Middle Eastern countries to prevent terrorism, we think they actually can carry that out. They are competent in doing that. But that actually terrifies me as a person who would not want that.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that that's the difference between business and politics is that third, the normative, that I have preferences in terms of values. And competence might actually be the worst case.
In our next survey, this is exactly what we're going to do. Mm-hmm. We're going to put in position and see whether associative issue ownership matters still on top of whether you agree with the party's position, yes or no. So that, absolutely. So we need to, the robustness of, the competitor we put it up against is only competence issue ownership. It's not position yet. So we need position, and if associative issue ownership still contributes to the vote, then we have a much more robust finding than what we have
I
so
think the
far.
interactions are going to be really
Yeah.
interesting. They're really interesting.
The thing is, how do you measure position? Because we need official positions of parties and not perceptions of positions, because perceptions of positions screws up the whole thing. We need the real position of party and then the real position of the vote.
Manifestos to work
Yeah.
on.
Well,
Yeah, but the manifestos don't contradict each other. That's a problem.
that is the problem.
Okay.
Yeah, that's generally the problem.
Uh-huh.
But that's why
there are
we-
certain certain countries, Germany for example, where manifesto results have never been strong, and so they're
The thing
just
is,
yeah.
what we do in Belgium, you know, that those kind of voting aid applications where people are, I build them together with my colleagues, where we give advice to voters what party to vote for. So we give them 50 statements, give answers to those 50 statements, and we ask the party leaders to give answers to the same 50 statements. If you have every party leader giving answers to 50 statements, then you know the official position of a party. So that's the data we're going to use in our next, that's really position on 50 or 30. 50 is a little much for voters, I guess, but on 20 or 25. That's the idea. Okay.
That was just my question.
Yeah, but it's a good question and absolutely to the point. So associative and competition issue ownership are two different things, reacting differently to party messages. But that's the new unwritten, it has been written, but my co-author should still take a look at it. So issue ownership is variable and dynamic. Media not only activate existing issue ownership by agenda setting, but create issue ownership through news selection. Okay? Associative issue ownership evolves differently than competency issue ownership, different reactions on party messages. Is this really a media effect? I don't think so. Because media, of course, follow cues by parties. So I don't want to say that the media are making issue ownership, but they contribute, they are the link between what parties send out as communication and what happens in the heads of the voters. Okay. Competence issue ownership is endogenous. I'm just going to show you one thing. So here, on a correlational level, associative issue ownership is not related to party preference. Correlation is inexistent. Competence issue ownership is strongly related to party preference. Of course, doesn't say anything about the direction, but there is a weak correlation between the two dimensions. It's 0.22. If people are asked to classify parties and issues, it's on 2.7% of the 5 issues, it's the same. So there is a correlation, of course, but it's pretty weak, and the correlation with party preference is entirely different. We did an experiment on that too, but I'm not going to explain it to you. Okay. Conclusion, general conclusion. It has several dimensions. Associative issue ownership, that's my big endeavor, is better for analysis on voting. It's not endogenous. And competence issue ownership is too close to party preference. It has effect on voting, both on the aggregate as on the individual level. It interacts with salience as it should, otherwise it makes no sense at all. If you don't care about an issue, why would competence issue ownership or issue ownership at all have an impact on what you vote? And media play a role in activating issue ownership and in creating issue ownership. And it's dynamic. That's it. I'm sorry for being so long.
Oh no.
No.
The only thing that I don't really buy, where I kind of have a strong feeling, is about the media role, because to me that's where the endogeneity still is. I think in any of the evidence you've presented, I can't see whether the media are creating or activating. Now, part of that is I don't know enough about the time, right?
Yeah.
But so one notion on the associative side, and this is what I really like about the associative side, is there you have the party is a left party on this issue space, right? They've branded there, right? And that's sort of our primitive, that's where we put them in a spatial model,
Yeah.
right? So we've got that. What the media can do then is strengthen that, right? For example, suppose there's a distribution of voters who are likely to vote for that party, right? Which part of what your story is, it's better for predicting this.
Yeah.
So suppose the distribution is has a big variance, right? So what the media can do is narrow the variance through that selection mechanism, right? But the party can also help the media doing that by only talking about that issue as well. And so they're both having that impact, right? If you wanted to write down a model, they're both having that impact on the distribution of likely voters for the party, right? Of narrowing the variance. But it could be the party takes an active role by only opening its mouth on immigration, right? And that kind of campaign strategy, I think, is something that your data right now can't sort out, and I just feel there's a bit of hand waving on that one.
Yes, the thing is here, I think there is a big difference between parties. Some parties cannot afford to shut up. Government parties must communicate.
That's true.
Which is entirely different for opposition parties. Opposition parties can pick their fight and say, okay, we're not an immigration party, an immigration issue comes, and we just, even if journalists come to us, we don't give any comments. So it's an asymmetrical relationship between the freedom, the degrees of freedom of the government party and an opposition party to address an issue. So this is what we see, for example, is we've done other, agenda setting stuff in which we show that if media start mentioning an issue, opposition parties follow their party manifesto much more. Let me explain this. So if there is, again, immigration in the news, the parties in the opposition who devoted a lot of attention to immigration will start asking questions in Parliament, question time. The parties in the government who had a lot of attention to immigration in their party manifesto won't. Because, they promised something, there is obviously a problem, otherwise there wouldn't be the media coverage. So that's why there's a real difference between government and opposition parties, and opposition parties are much more loyal to their party manifesto in their communication than government parties are, especially in a coalition system. In a coalition system, there is a coalition agreement, which means that there is no freedom for party in the coalition to address any issue, because they made promises to each other. So so we can show this. And then another thing, and what we're working on now, is correlation with party manifestos. So I know you work on States of the Union speeches, party manifestos. What we're trying to do now is to do an analysis of the press releases of parties over time via their website, 2 or 3 years, and then see which of those press releases get into the news, and whether in that news item the link between the issue and the party is made. So there we have the independent variable, the real independent variable, party's choice to do a press release or to make a press release on a certain issue.
And I would wonder if you don't have a quasi-experiment when somebody signs a coalition agreement. So for example, I'm given my press releases, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not in government at all, but I've given my press releases. Anytime you come and talk to me, hey, don't worry, I'm glad to tell you about immigration because that's what's getting me on the map. And then I get enough vote share and I have to sign a coalition agreement. I wonder if at that point the media, I wonder if that's when you can identify this effect that the media can actually create or maintain issue ownership in that point. So now the party, now you come to me and I'm the Minister for Agriculture and you ask me about agriculture and I can't not tell you, right, which is absolutely true. But you don't cover that. You only cover it when I talk about or my party still only puts out press release or whatever. I wonder if you can identify the effect there.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's a good idea, but then you need, I think we have press releases from 2006 onwards to 2011. You need one change of government. Yeah.
But the other thing.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
The Belgium effect, because Belgium is a small country, as you say, though it's divided in two, and that was a very big issue. Some of the ideas about the influence of the press and are probably more intimate than the United States, which is, large, multiple presses, not necessarily well coordinated. The only thing we have equivalent to that is sort of, I think, the conservative TV stations.
Yeah, we don't have that.
Yeah, but
this is just the size of the market. My theory is that the bigger the market, the more partisan the media would be. Because there is no profit to make in Belgium with having a conservative TV channel. This market is just too small.
Right.
Not even, you can't even have profit with a conservative newspaper. So all newspapers are very much alike. In the center, it's the median voter, median visa.
So that's the point. There's a Belgian effect, which when you go to some other place,
Yes.
it is concerned about the media because it's intimate.
Yeah, but there you have a self-selection effect, a strong self-selection effect, which we can, at least we can argue in Belgium that or in many smaller democracies, multi-party democracies, that it doesn't really matter. But you're absolutely right.
So if you go to some place which is more diverse,
Yeah.
it might be different. The influence of the media would be different.
Yes.
But I think that's important in the sense that in a small place, that may give a much better explanation than a big place. Whether it's indigeneity or not, doesn't matter. It's just that it's...
But I'm more interested in how journalists decide which actor they show in a news item and which they don't. And whether that associative issue ownership, that association that journalists make, whether this really matters. And this should matter in a two-party or in a multi-party, a big or a small democracy.
Have people studied this kind of stuff?
I don't think so. There has been a study by Sides in the US about...
Oh, that John Sides guy, yeah.
Yeah, he has done something on media and issues and parties.
That's true.
Yeah. But it's a while ago, 2006, I think.
Yeah, but it'd be an interesting
But I
question
forgot
to
what it
ask and to study in some sense who are the talking heads
Yeah.
on the news,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks, Stefan.